everybody.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed the first segment. Our second segment should be just as good. Before we get into it, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Also remember that you can leave questions, comments, or concerns about the show at the link as well, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of the day with a guy who definitely is one of the most experienced defenders in the NFC East, and definitely one of the most experienced defenders in a secondary that is trying to rebuild, but kind of stuck in this weird stasis where you have these guys who are young, but then you also have this veteran guy who might still have something to say about that corner competition, and that is Darius Slay. The Eagles' secondary has always been one of their points of contention, no matter if it has been stellar or a little bit underwhelming. And what I mean by that is the constant additions, the constant kind of development of different storylines surrounding this secondary due to its myriad number of players leads me to consider Darius Slay as someone who might not be highly coveted, but B, still can add value not just as a veteran, but because of his intelligence in the system. He's been around the league. He knows what it takes to be a premier corner, and now it was likely to be his final stop, even though he's been talking about potentially, if not having a good season with the Eagles, going to another team, it potentially could be his final stop. There's a lot to learn here for Darius Slay as this secondary gets kind of a younger breath of fresh air feel to it. And so, even though I really like him still, he's an interesting fantasy option in terms of IDP to peruse, but there definitely are more caveats now than bright spots to Darius Slay. But let's look over his fantasy career, and you can make of it what you will. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 812.7 fantasy points. His best season was actually in Detroit when he had 111 fantasy points in 2017. Last year, there were some bright spots in terms of stats, but there were some lowlights. 48 solo tackles, but only 1 tackle for loss. 15 passes defended still, and 2 interceptions. And so, when I look at Darius Slay, and I look at his expertise at the corner position, his understanding of certain systems that younger corners might not be able to understand, I still see some value that's not just sentiment and not just, because it's Darius Slay. I still see the fact that he is someone who can step into a system, can learn from what he sees in the secondary to develop himself and have it translate onto the field. And at the end of the day, he is still a fantastic cover man. My only concern is that in certain situations, he might need more range than he currently has. And since he's slowing down in terms of, what he's able to do, and certain abilities and certain agilities that are required of him, I think that maybe, it's a little bit safer to shy away from him. And to top it all off, he did have that back injury in their wild card game against the Bucs. So there are some concerns with an aging corner in a secondary that is kind of looking to move past him a little bit. So let's talk about this secondary, though, because I still see some silver linings to him potentially having a huge workload in this season, and it should be one of his final seasons. So the Eagles' approach to their secondary is much like their approach to all of the other defense positions. Kind of approach it through youth and through development. Darius Slay, if you've noted, has been one of the only constants from kind of their trade situations where they acquired certain secondary pieces. Gone is Garner Johnson, gone are some other people, and now you're looking at a room where, outside of Darius Slay, the only really experienced person in that secondary outside of him is Reed Blankenship. And then you bring in guys like Quinion Mitchell, who definitely is going to be one of their more rangy, long, versatile corners. And then you bring in Cooper DeJean, who can definitely play many different parts in this defense. And you say to yourself, well, if I'm Darius Slay, what does this mean for how I integrate myself into this defense? Because I'm still here, and even though my role might be lightened a little bit, I still have a responsibility, I still have a workload, no matter how desperate my situation looks. Because yes, these young kids, they can play many parts in the system, but they still don't know the intricacies of this defense, and that's to my advantage. So Darius Slay has to weigh his options, because right now he's in a very pivotal spot right here. Because the Eagles secondary has been, throughout his tenure there, heavily scrutinized, heavily criticized, much maligned as for an area of need for the Eagles. And ultimately, Darius Slay has been at the center of those discussions for many years to come. Now, in 2024 and 25, the Eagles are starting to realize that, hey, our secondary might need a more youthful look. We're going to go out and get Mitchell through the draft and DeJean through the draft. And so, Darius Slay now has a decision to make. He can either accept that his workload might be lightened, or he can step into the role of leader and lead by example on the field. He may not be the guy who is Quinion Mitchell. He may not be the guy who is versatile in Cooper DeJean, but he still is someone who has the NFL experience, is willing to play, and most importantly, is a vocal leader for a secondary in transition. And eventually, sooner rather than later, Darius Slay is going to be either out of the league or on a different team. And so, in what could be his final season in Philly, this is his opportunity to say, I'm still elite, maybe not as elite as before, and I'm also a vocal leader for a younger group of players in my secondary. Now here's where kind of workload comes into play. Say the Eagles see Cooper DeJean as more of a linebacker hybrid player, and they want him to be an energetic guy who's active in the blitz, can drop into coverage, can play sideline to sideline. That benefits, Darius Slay, because it takes away competition for one of those corner spots, and it's ultimately up to him, Blankenship, and Quinion Mitchell. Now, if you look at Blankenship, he is still very young. He does have experience in the secondary, but does he have enough to warrant important snaps on different downs? Does he warrant being out there in more difficult situations where it could require A, intelligence, and B, speed, which now leaves Slay and Mitchell, which I actually think is the perfect cornerback pairing for this Eagles secondary. If you think about it, Quinion Mitchell makes up for a lot of deficiencies in speed that Darius Slay might have. And Darius Slay is still the perfect cover man. Whether the Eagles play man or zone, Darius Slay's intelligence and ability to diagnose different coverages and different routes makes him an asset. And pairing him with Quinion Mitchell makes the speed factor a little bit more intriguing, because when you add intelligence and speed together, you get two players who A, can make tackles, and B, can create positive plays for the defense, like pass breakups and interceptions. So Darius Slay, in terms of IDP, still has merit, because as a coverage guy, he's going to be the guy who sees a lot of balls thrown his way, and maybe to, make up for what he lacks in speed, he's going to be someone who people can think, hey, I can get away with throwing to Darius Slay. But that could also benefit his stat-wise, and that's why I think he's still an intriguing option IDP. Not just because of his experience, but because of how he's developed as a player in this league, and because of how his deficiencies can play into his strengths a little bit here, and the strengths of other players in the secondary. And so, while Darius Slay may be slowing down, and this could be his last year in the league, and he could not be an Eagle either, he could move to a different team, he still is valuable in terms of his presence, in terms of what he brings, in terms of diagnosing routes, and most importantly, the fact that he has a chance to be a vocal leader for the secondary. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming up, we switch from the Eagles to the Patriots. We have a couple AFC East guys coming up. What does Matthew Judon's season look like for the Patriots as one of their best defenders? We will be right back to discuss him on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.